Wow. Thank you all for being here. This is a special moment for 1,000 reasons. One, it is the first event of the semester in the Kelly Writers House. That's awesome. It's the night before the first day of school for many people. I know of many people who are starting second grade or fourth grade or sixth grade tomorrow who are just a pile of feelings right now. I'm a pile of feelings for them. It's also the second semesterly City Planning Poetics event, this one focused on tools that change the built environment, and I'm so lucky to be in the company of Jason Mitchell and FRANCESCA RUSSELLO AMMON, and I'm so glad you guys have given us your time and your amazing childhood toys have lent us those things so that we can be in the same room with them. So I'm going to give sort of a long-form introduction to Jason's work and to FRANCESCA's work, and then they're each going to talk and show you some slides. And since it is the first program of this semester, we are still adjusting to the tech. So we will have some technical confusion in which I'll make furrowed, nervous faces, and Zach will come and help me fix things. And I'm glad I'm not more familiar with technology than I am. There's enough. So I'll enjoy my tech unfamiliarity in those moments. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm so pleased to introduce FRANCESCA RUSSELLO AMMON and Jason Mitchell and to welcome you all to the second semesterly City Planning Poetics event. This event is focused on the tools that change the built environment. I'll start by introducing you to our two speakers individually, and then I'll speak about their projects in the context of one another, the formal version of what I just said looking at you, just so we're all clear. FRANCESCA RUSSELLO AMMON is an assistant professor of city and regional planning and historic preservation in the School of Design, a cultural historian of the urban built environment. She has published articles on topics including urban renewal, gentrification, and children's books about destruction.
Yes.
There'll be some of that.
My favorite. Her recent book, Jason, you want to hold it up? It's an amazing thing. I spent the weekend with it, and it was like a kind, smart, intimidating friend. Bulldozer, Demolition and Clearance of the Postwar Landscape, it just came out in April, traces the transformation of this iconic machine from wartime weapon to instrument of postwar planning. As a Mellon researcher at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, she is now beginning a project on the role of photographs in shaping post-war historic preservation and urban renewal, which seems like a logical continuation from this project. You'll see, I'm sure, in the way that you talk about it here, and it's also true in the book, that photography is doing a lot of work to help think about sort of bulldozer ideology and where our conceptions of bulldozers come from. And photographs and awesome toys are some of those places. Jason Mitchell is most recently the author of Field for Peter Cully. Want to hold that up?
Sure.
These things are all really attractive. I want you to see them. Self-published in 2015, and is the host and coordinator of the Philadelphia reading series, Frank O'Hara's Last Lover, where I have seen many of my favorite readings I have seen ever, and had my life enriched and my breath taken away many times, and can't thank him enough for running that series. This is also just an excuse running the series to just tell people whose work I love that I love them. I'm enjoying this. His writing can be found in High Zero, Court Green, Jacket 2, and Stolen Island, among others. What you don't learn about Jason from his bio is that by day, Jason is a municipal inspector and land surveyor, and his attention and observant poetic work draws on the kinds of observations of landscape and infrastructure that surveying requires. I was interested to bring Jason and FRANCESCA together because they both consider the history of the built environment and the tools that change it, but also artistic representation of and engagements with those tools and their effects. The writing asks questions of the kinds of cross-disciplinary frames necessary to really engage the built environment and its history. The engine of the City Planning Poetics series is the idea that poets who are interested in the built environment, and social scientists or planning historians in this case, can make a different kind of sense of the built environment together than the one they make alone or in their own disciplines, and that the dynamic process in which they figure out what they have to say to each other might elucidate the kinds of questions and tools necessary to address those features of the built environment and its history and of making and remaking that are both crucial and overlooked. So I'm especially pleased that Jason and FRANCESCA, who are both interested in overlooked structures and details of the built environment and its history, are here for the series' second event. Bulldozer, Francesca's new and really spectacular book, has several intersecting and overlapping projects, including a history of the bulldozer and its use in American post-war development from World War II to the Vietnam era, a history of demolition more broadly in that same time period, a cultural history of the figure of the bulldozer and bulldozer operator, perhaps America's last large-scale working-class hero, a bold, complicated idea, a bulldozer operator as cowboys, the one I am working on, as well as the opposition to development projects that endangered and degraded the landscape, and the role of that opposition in catalyzing the early stages of 1970s environmentalism. The book borrows from a number of fields outside of planning history, including the study of children's literature, technological history, and art history. It is the first academic history of the bulldozer, a thing I learned that I needed in my life once I found it, cleaving together the machine's use in World War II and the technological enhancements it received with its post-war employment in American highway construction, land clearance for suburban housing, and urban renewal projects. The book focuses additionally on what Francesca terms the culture of clearance, looking at children's books and toys that featured bulldozers and, she argues, normalized land clearance as being synonymous with progress. She also discusses earthworks and conceptual art by Robert Smithson, Dennis Oppenheim, Gordon Matta-Clark, and others. Jason's work also addresses the union of the processes that change the built environment and the space those processes can occupy in art, although the art in his case is his own. The title of Jason's most recent project, Field, has within it the surveyor's field, but also the poet's field, and perhaps even the expanded field or composition by field of avant-garde poetics. Field is a long poem made up of fragments and litanies, with short-line stanzas of varying lengths set into the negative space of diagrams of streets, neighborhoods, visual instructions for tree planting, and detailed drawings of the proper installation of street signs. Both the language of the poem and the diagrams consider the relationship between built and natural environments, how they interact, and at what expense. Field demonstrates itself as a project that is both about and occasioned by paying attention. It is deeply engaged with reading, but also with looking. It is a project for which the page is as large and dynamic a space as the landscape. The poem skews toward the small scale, offering snapshots like the one with which it opens. Small brown toad, size of a golf ball, stumped into standing water, not quite, a pond beyond the white gazebo. In another moment, dried chips of spray paint mixing in cylindrical flight with cherry petals blown across a construction site. Moments of Jason's project feel like they're in conversation with William Carlos Williams, writing about the importance of imagination in the wake of industrial and mechanical development in his 1923 collection, Spring and All, and taking a breath between paragraphs to think famously about the tableau of farm equipment, a red wheelbarrow, next to livestock, white chickens, his So Much Depends, pointing out that the cultivation of land in a moment of industrialization could produce any number of outcomes. It is those relationships, human to land, cultivation to industrialization and subsequent clearance, and their outcomes that interest both Jason and Francesca. As I read and reread Bulldozer and Field, I kept thinking of and returning to the essay Projective Verse by the experimental poet and later Black Mountain College instructor Charles Olson. In that essay, which was published in 1950, Olson advocates for a poetic composition that uses the unit of breath instead of the unit of the line or the syllable or other received form. He calls this process composition by field and says of it, a poem is energy transferred from where the poet got it by way of the poem itself to all the way over to the reader. This process of energy transfer from its origins and development through human bodies is one way of considering what Francesca is tracing in Bulldozer. This process is what composes a city, energy transferred from where planners, engineers, and designers got it by way of streets and buildings to urban residents. I understand Jason and Francesca both to be following the trajectory of processes that are part construction and part art making, but I also understand them to be putting pressure on that energy. Where does that energy come from, they ask? What was taken apart or destroyed to make something that might look to someone like progress? Displacement feels like an inevitable conversation in both of their projects. In reading their work, I can't help but become aware of everything that I do and the way that it displaces something or did. I start to wonder about what the land my house is built on was like before 1892 when it was constructed, and about how the grading of the land on which Penn's campus is built changed to accommodate Penn's buildings. Most kinds of displacement have a kind of violence within them, In her discussion of Orange Grove clearance in Orange County, California, to make way for suburban development, Francesca notes that in 1945, the county contained over 66,000 acres of Valencia oranges, and in 2014 contained exactly 85 acres, which is terrifying. The site of displacement in both of these projects is often the field. It's fields that make up the lion's share of the American landscape that is destroyed by interstate highway construction. But these projects also seek to displace a disciplinary understanding of an academic or artistic field into which they fit. The field of these projects is one in which cultivation occurs alongside interdisciplinary academic fields, as well as Olson's composition by field in Jason's work, and its corollary in the conceptual art and earthworks that Francesca discusses in her book's final chapter. Jason's poems find in detail the tensions that Francesca historicizes on a national level and over a period of decades. Both of their projects raise questions for me of what role the somatic experience of displacement plays in understanding the culture of clearance. It makes me curious, too, about whose voices are available in the history of clearance. For whom is the bulldozer operator heroic, as Francesca notes, as he is portrayed by advertisements and toys alike, and for whom does the gesture toward heroism obfuscate or blur the experience of displacement? Whose stories are brought together by demolition and which ones get told? How can a focus on the material history of the construction and reconstruction of the built environment taken alongside its somatic or sensory experiences Jason explores, or its ideological impact, what Francesca calls bulldozers of the mind, a great use of poetry and planning history if ever there were one. Thank you, Ferlinghetti. Demonstrate what it means to live among and imagine the results of mid-century urban and suburban change. I am so overwhelmingly excited to welcome Francesca and Jason to City Planning Poetics and to the Kelly Writers House.
Geez, Davy, that's going to be hard to follow. Yeah, I can see it well enough. How do I switch it, though?
Like that.
Okay.
So yeah, you get something different on the screen.
Oh, I see. Okay, cool.
Look up there.
Davy, thank you so much for those kind words and for inviting me here. I'm so honored to take part in this series that I was so excited when I heard about it originally, and I'm so excited to see where it goes next in the spring. I'm also really honored to be here with you, Francesca. I've been reading in and out of Bulldozer all summer long, and I've found a lot of fantastically interesting things there. I brought my own Tonka dump truck in as a small homage to Chapter 6. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the tools of my trade, and then I'll read a couple poems to display how working with those tools and being around tools and machines have shaped my own poems, and in turn and in part how poems can sometimes also shape the built environment. So, as Davey mentioned, I work as both a land surveyor and a municipal inspector. And I'm actually going to focus on the latter today because it's the one that most clearly contributed to the poems that I'll read, and specifically to this first one, which I showed you already, called Field for Peter Cully, which I'll just bring up a detail real quick out of. We'll start with that one. So, in municipal inspection, I am often on construction sites, so I'm surrounded by tools and machines all day, every day. But the most important tools that I use as an inspector are actually a set of plans and a set of specifications. So I brought a set of plans in that I was working with actually just this morning. And these plans and the specs are something that an engineer at my office has designed and put together and equipped me with to go to a site and basically work with a contractor and a set of construction workers to build the thing that he's designed the way the plan is asking it to be built and with the materials that the specifications are asking for. And so basically let me open these up so you can. These are so terrible to try to open up in your car and work with, which is what I do most of the day. That's my hardest task, I think. So here we have a set of plans for Deptford Local Roads, which is a town in New Jersey, southern New Jersey. And basically we're replacing a number of these roads. And so opening it up to any page, you can see that that we have a number of roads and then details as to how that road will be replaced with what materials, at what grade, and any number of things down to the way the inlet will be placed, what kind of inlet, the kind of curb we'll use in a specific space. And then if you go further to the back of this set of plans, you have more details on some of those very specific things, such as curb and gutter inlet. One of my favorites is here at the top. It's depressed curb. So that's part of the fun of going through a lot of this language that I wasn't familiar with only a couple years ago, before I had started working as a municipal inspector specifically. And it was a close engagement with both those specs and plans that began to inspire and eventually, as you see, become a part of the poem Field for Peter Cully. In the poem that I have up here on the screen, basically I was writing these poems often on the job, often in the margins of these plans and specs, often very quickly. And at the end of a day, I came back to the office and I decided to see what would happen if I transposed one of them on top of one of the maps that I found interesting. I think all that I found particularly interesting about this map, this wetland ribbons location map, is that we're on a road called Good Intent Road, right? And so that's one of the ways that the poems interact with the images, is that they sort of highlight or ask you to take time to investigate what the relationship between these two things might be. And some of the poets and artists, Robert Smithson was someone I was thinking about, another is Christopher Dewdney, and Peter Cully, for whom the poem is dedicated to. And Peter's work, actually Peter's first book does have visuals in it. They're very small photographs. He has a photograph on the front of this cover. In his very last book, he has a beautiful photograph of what appears to be scrap metal that I believe he calls Angelus Novus, or Angel of History. And basically, Pete was a Canadian poet who lived and wrote in a town called Nanaimo, and like Olson or William Carlos Williams, he was someone who was writing about his place in the world, specifically this place in Nanaimo, which he semi-fictively called Hammertown, which was something he gleaned in a George Perec text about a Vancouver fishing island called Hammertown that he saw as his own place. Pete's poetry and his poems are endlessly dear to me and have been for a while, and in part they taught me how to look at these things, how to look at construction sites and heavy machinery and to write about those things. And so when he unfortunately passed away in April of 2015, I began writing these poems as a kind of homage to him. And yeah, so I guess I'll start there and read. We'll go back to the beginning. Oh, I should also mention that I made all of these books at my work, too. So you can see my company's, and that stamp's from the company, too, and the paper. Sorry. Field for Peter Cully. Or one of them perambulate in white moths, fluttering up and down in flight. I guess I'm going to try to do this. I think I can get it. Thank you, Francesca. Structural failure of permafrost-laden roadside culvert patching. Alligator cracking across cart width. Small brown toad size of a golf ball stumped into standing water, not quite upon beyond the white gazebo. Estimated slump strength plane overhead of an idling dozer's dozing idler, feathered thick strips of marl torn up in the form of bone plates on a dyno's back, tractor tracks, pipe type, inlets, precast supplier, stone sub-base, watertight coupler, ram necks, jumping jack, tampstein, compaction, length, and time times time, remediated and spelled backwards in concrete. Heart size doubling, regaining, despair waning, asphalt type dewatering, thrust restraint, dried chips of spray paint mixing in, cylindrical flight with cherry petals blown across a construction site. A cavitation, concatenation of silvery starlight planing midnight or shiny tiny bubbles on the back of a big ship's earth propeller, interstellar contact. Cold weather blanket lift, tar and tack coating a new street's black HMA asphalt curb brick handicap ramp. Thermoplastic traffic marks a glitter and a sharp sun near a laundromat. Snow like a white night, pledging fealty to a stoplight. Undergoblin, grotto pocked with gem marina cranberry expansion. Shoreline stabilization fill, dune tower penny-headed wishing well. Dredge lagoon, post-storm event dredge, post-bulkhead failure, post-shellfish. Self-illuminating emergency egress lighting on the wall of a bathroom stall. Solar salt, still music, boxing the tar roads with its raised blots that once were dots. Tidal flat land flood plain safety zone handicap ramp, stone tamp escrow for closed housing, pave milliner, concrete filler, oil spiller, jackhammer. Desultory dragonfly. Concrete bollard. Boss ass butterfly, boss blue jay, boss ass fern, boss broken branch, boss ass tractor, contractor. Pitch pine, canopy understory, low bush blueberry, sheep laurel, dense, broken bent, Timothy. Pervious grasses beside wind and seismic tie-down anchors planted. Post hole digger, metal detector, field book, no look past behind the back. Little yellow property line cap and a brown box on a short stack of bright pink flagging tape. A branch is gone. The one outside my window where every now and then a young bird would sit and queer. Unrotted small grain straw, half free of seeds and salt hay, a lay. Aluminum pre-engineered stair landings and ramps. Bon temps, more. So that's Field for Peter Cully. The second poem I'm going to read today is called On Dreaming. I translated Virgil's Georgics with George Stanley. Coincidentally, Stanley is another poet living and writing in and around Vancouver, and Peter and George are two of my poet heroes. And I'd like to think that my poems share some of the same concerns as they're specifically about lyric poetry and about beauty and about place. This poem is a few years old now, and it's actually from the first job I worked as a municipal inspector. And I was working with a crew of millers and pavers to install one of these roads in Deptford, New Jersey, actually. And the crew I was working with, every crew sort of has their own personality now that I've worked with, tens of them, and all sort of directed by this guiding spirit of the foreman. And sometimes they can be kind of goofy, and I've actually had gentle crews, believe it or not, of construction workers. But this first crew that I had was just super macho. I mean, just super macho group of guys. And then there are these loud, fuming machines that I've never been closer to, literally shaking the earth beneath me. Rollers and tamps, a miller chewing up the existing road and spinning it out into the back of a triaxle truck. And I think I was equal parts mesmerized and terrified by all this, right? And amidst all that, here I am, long hair, writing poetry, champion of pleasure and beauty, right? Wondering, what am I doing here? And how might I write about these new things that I'm encountering, these giant machines and these tools? And I had antecedents in Peter's work, who writes beautifully about machinery and construction sites, even when he's writing about the destruction of spaces. I mean, Peter's, one of his great talents is, even when he's writing about these things that are not particularly pleasant scenes, he writes about them in such a way that's so gorgeous that it at least lends some balance to the world. So let me find this poem. On Dreaming, I translated Virgil's Georgics with George Stanley. This pacifist lab tech I once knew in Syringa, very fair-haired guy, but frightened to death of every other living thing breathing the same air as you and I, telling me about his past life as a flower, ambrosia, etc., sexual desire, material life abandoned for the sole joy of making honey, for which bees in sunny storms died trying to balance themselves in flight by carrying small rocks but end up dying. Begins also telling me he thinks I'm a lion, St. Jerome's in fact, son of Deuteronomy, city of Strap-on, province of colonoscopy. Whatever shall we do about the abandoned shopping cart problem now engulfing the U.S.? Thousands of empty vessels impervious to the wind being ridden by bored teens into ditches and gullies sprung with red iron and old sofa cushions coiling in full decay, being symbols themselves of capitalism's shadow forces gone astray. Wheels wobbly and spinning across cracked bituminous lots. Once I spied a T-shirt rocked by an old grizzled, constantly smoking miller that read, "Pave the world," in big red letters across the back. Wordplay and a crew of knee-slapping, grab-ass counterparts kicking cans in the dust, admiring and preferring the old-fashioned square grills of 18-wheel trucks to the more streamlined modern ones. Was it a dream I'd had about being a flower, a tiny thing of beauty without even the ardor of the bee? I had at some point intended to sing and make singing my duty above the others, and so bring beauty, as well I could, into the world, and make that the thing. But somewhere along the way, what was thought beautiful made a mockery of me, or I of it. The Wolverine licensed boots or thin blade of morning. If Aristaeus rather than Orpheus were to say, "I am your source," what then? The bees out of a lion's guts, honey made. Thank you. Thanks for bringing that up, Davy.
What do you think, Zach? How are we doing? Someday, this screen is gonna open its jaws and just consume me, and no one will wear it. I'm ready to do this. Yeah, in the PowerPoint. And then we're gonna have to do this two more times in the video.
If you just view the slideshow.
You think that will happen?
I have great faith that
You
it
have
will.
great faith that it will. Okay.
Okay.
How would you feel if we did the videos at the end?
Sure. That's
okay?
fine. Yeah.
Let's do that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Davy, for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to have been invited to this conversation. Thank you, Jason. Wonderful to hear you read the work, and a treat to be up here. My PhD is in American Studies, and I'm very interested in the intersection of fields and disciplines. So this is just wonderful, and I think that hopefully that comes through in the book as well. And going by the prompt of this session, I took a slice through the book, thinking about the tools that shape the landscape. Obviously, Bulldozer is one of my answers for what does that, but construction tools in general. And I use the term bulldozer as a kind of shorthand, as people do, for a lot of different things, a lot of different tools, a lot of different ideologies, in fact, focused on clearance and removal. And as I was telling Jason, the project's really about clearance, but bulldozer is the shorthand that I think everyone can latch on to a little bit more. These are bulldozers lined up to go to war on the Pacific front. They're international harvesters, some of them bulldozers, some other instruments waiting to be sent out to the Pacific. And the term bulldozer, I should say, technically speaking, is just that front blade that pushes things. When it's not just a pretty flat, slightly curved blade, it's not a bulldozer, actually, although people call lots of things bulldozers. And the tractor and bulldozer is another one of those things that we call a bulldozer, but that's a tractor and a bulldozer. But anyway, just to be precise. So these are all the machines going out to war, because war is an important starting point for my story, this question of where do these tools come from? And so I have a lot of images, probably too many, but this is an advertisement from World War II, which calls the war a dirt-moving war, in fact. And why would International Harvesters say that? Well, of course, it catered to their sales, future sales, because they weren't selling domestically during the war. But bulldozers and lots of construction equipment were important to the war, and Army engineers used them, and a new group called the Naval Seabees, the construction battalions, were created to bring construction men into the military and serve the effort. In large part in the Pacific, building highways, airfields, setting up bases, construction was one of the key tools of the military during the war. And so this story of construction equipment being one of our tools and one of the things that helped America win the war, right, the United States win, is embedded in these advertisements. In fact, General Patton apparently was quoted saying if he had to choose between a tank and a bulldozer, he'd choose the bulldozer every time. It was so important. And that's a story that you can find corroborated in lots of different media from the effort. These images are from a Caterpillar Tractor Company annual report from during the war, showing two of the big roles that bulldozers played. One in clearing and moving earth, in this case for a landing strip there, and on the right, removing rubble in the European front of damaged cities. And on the right, it's a messy scene, but this language of cleaning, clearing and cleaning, and focus on rebuilding and how these tools can be instruments of progress starts getting narrated there. And in fact, people come home to the United States and see opportunities to clean our cities, even though they hadn't been damaged in the same way. Another advertisement from International Harvester saying that in order to bring this equipment into the war, all they had to do was paint the machines, olive instead of yellow. That's the only change they had to make. But during the war, everything changed. But the paint, that is, the insides of the machines were improved by the conflict. And to some degree, that is true. The machines got faster. The investment in R&D, in the technology, they could carry more, they could do things more quickly, such that the cost of moving dirt remained pretty constant from the 30s through the war, and that's important. It was cheap to move buildings and move dirt, move people in the process. And so they start this marketing effort of telling people back home, well, you can't buy machines now, but when you can, they're going to be great, they're worth waiting for, so we'll advertise, as many companies did during the war. They also associated this effort with the very Americanness of what was going on, defeating the enemy through construction equipment. So these machines weren't just strong and practical projects. They were actually defeating symbolically and practically the enemy, and they were fighting for democracy. So these machines, construction work, the idea of it becomes synonymous with American power and becomes a very American thing coming out of the war. Stories like this one, this is a cartoon of a sea bee who apparently came off of a boat to clear a base and had to actually battle Japanese combatants and plowed over them with his bulldozer. So the bulldozer became actually a weapon. And this story, I went looking for it, is repeated in countless journalistic sources, newspapers, magazines. Not a lot of this happened a lot, but the stories were repeated a lot. So you get this mythology of the bulldozer operator and how this machine becomes a patriotic weapon as well as a practical tool. So my argument is that the war was really important in casting the bulldozer in a certain light, such that when the machine and the operators came home, they came home on a pedestal in a certain way. Movies like this one called The Fighting Seabees, starring John Wayne, also contributed to this. Wayne and his Seabee troops battle combatants on an island in the Pacific, and Wayne actually dies, which is unusual for him in films, in this climactic scene, but the bulldozer keeps riding on. He gets shot, he keeps riding on, and the bulldozer saves the day. So you know where this is going. So it's just one of the really interesting research exercises here was just finding all of these stories that really added up to the same narrative coming out of the war. But practically speaking, what were Seabees doing with these machines? They were battling the jungle. The landscape becomes an enemy as well, right? And they're clearing the way, as I said, for those airfields, bases, and highways in the Pacific. They're also knocking down homes and buildings. And the clearance of buildings and land are really the two key activities that I focus on. They're getting comfortable with these acts. They're also learning the practicalities of how to do these things. And I've traced several individuals who come home and start companies, wrecking companies, land clearance companies to put these skills to work on the home front. And here you can see, this is a symbolic picture, but this is Robert Moses doing a similar thing to what we saw the CB doing there. On a highway project, another operator clearing land and rocks. Another bulldozer operator after the war making the way for suburbs and clearing the earth for that. So it's the creation of these large-scale remade landscapes, all of which rely upon cleared flat land, blank slates, or supposedly blank slates, for suburbs, for interstate highways, and for urban renewal, all of which rely upon the ideology and the practical work of machines like the bulldozer. So we talk about these things separately, but they're all united by a similar starting conception of how we should remake the land and tools that help us to do that. So we create in all three of those cases, in the upper left, these flat building pads for suburban homes, clearance for highways, and clearance for urban renewal. This is a scene in New Haven. Very often, these cleared landscapes survive for a very long time, although they're supposed to build new buildings, but they don't always, or it takes a long time. And so you're seeing the cleared landscapes for quite some time. Schools are also important in training operators, so they learned during the war. As I said, the Seabees brought in construction workers who knew how to do this and could get to work right away, but pretty soon they tapped out that supply of workers, and so new recruits were learning on the job. After the war, this training continues with these construction operating schools that start. And then children's books tell similar stories of, I liked the symmetry between the parade of construction equipment before and here in this book called Benny the Bulldozer, where the bulldozer helps get the highway finished in time, and there's a big parade. Everyone's very excited. These themes of, it's the 4th of July, these American patriotic themes, they all start to repeat. And children's books is actually where I started the project. I was looking for what are the sources to tell the story of destruction, because wrecking companies don't leave archives usually. They're typically these family-run little companies. Caterpillar won't let you see their archives, and so there are various problems. But children's books are what pops up when you enter Bulldozer and Clearance and Demolition into the card catalog. And it was just about this time, the 40s, 50s, 60s, that a lot of these books start appearing, helping young people, but also the adults who are reading them to them, start to make sense of what's going on and telling the story of patriotism, progress embedded in these machines. They tell about the operators themselves and depict them as friendly, affable, amiable bulldozer men, as this book tells you here. I want to be a road builder too. The two kids are just amazed and thrilled to be seeing this work going on. The machines themselves, as we know in books like these, make the machines friendly and non-scary. This question of, should I be amazed or scared? You should be amazed, is what these are saying, and thrilled to see these machines. This Katie and the Big Snow actually makes clear that the bulldozer is just a tractor with lots of different implements in the front, if you know that story. And other books show them as so friendly and happy that you can play in these machines. This is a book called Vermont Road Builder, kind of the ultimate success there. It just becomes a happy play thing. And then the Tonka truck is completely appropriate. 1946 is when these toys first appear. And another company called Model Toys, which is shown here, also has its products. But they're not just fun toys for kids to get involved in this work. They're actually collaborations with companies like Caterpillar. These are, many of them, the Model Toys in particular, really realistic replications, and some of the companies actually use them to test design. So they were practically useful in the technical sense, and they were great marketing devices. But it wasn't just bulldozers, and so I want to go through just a couple other machines just very quickly to say the bulldozer is the iconic machine, but there are other bits of equipment, shovels and excavators. You can think similar stories here, the cleaning work going on with the shovel on the left. Another book by Virginia Lee Burton. I should say she wrote The Little House. Also, she actually tells kind of both sides of the story, and she's interested in the reuse of old transportation technologies, the cable car in San Francisco. She wants the house to be able to move out away from the city that's engulfing it. But she's an exception, really, in her more critical engagement. Most of these books are very one-sided and often have the construction companies contributing technical information, photographs as well. The wrecking ball, of course, is another one of these instruments of destruction. This is from an article in Life magazine showing the mayor of New Haven operating this machine. Is it the physical act of doing this work that he wanted to celebrate? And the title of the article was City Cleanup Champion, because he's obviously cleaning the city. Look at this picture. Another photograph here with people observing, and it is the depiction of this and showing this as something to be celebrated that really struck me. If you look, there's a man in the front photographing this, and then the rush to document this, that stops after a while as people start to say, oh, let's not talk about the demolition, let's just talk about what comes after. But there is this moment where the mayor wants to be shown doing the tearing down. Children's books about this as well, telling us why tearing down is progress. It is building up. Why is it like that? Well, these machines, they're just like the dinosaurs, you know? So, this crane gets likened to kind of the natural evolution. Really simplistic storytelling, but the same stories that are being told in different terms in adult communications as well. Repeats, as you can see, the tropes repeat. And here are some women riding in a bucket on a CB base camp, enjoying a ride in a crane. These are fun. Other types of equipment on some road building projects. Margaret Bork-White was photographing these things. And these are some of the machines you were referring to, the rollers. It wasn't just the bulldozer. In order to actually get this land flat and ready, you had to move the dirt, and the scraper would help you with that. That's the machine towards the front on the left there. The roller would help to flatten it, the sheep's foot roller there, and get it ready for new construction. So there's a whole host of equipment that's part of this story that I'm kind of simplifying for you. A little schematic that this was technical work, kind of moving the earth from higher areas to lower areas, because how could you build, hundreds of the same house if the topography is not level? Well, you need to create these flat building pads. Opens up vast new areas for construction, particularly in hilly places like California, and it all becomes possible. They couldn't build there economically before until these machines could do this work. Just another shot. You just can't have enough shots of the clearance. And this is kind of the end product in some of these projects. This is out in California, these endless sea of flat building pads. we'll see if we get to the video there. But these come with consequences. So here you have a little boy holding his toy bulldozer, unable to stop the rock slide that has happened. When you disrupt the topography in this way and kind of think that everything can be made into these flat building pads, every place is a site for new construction, there are consequences. And in California, there were many of these landslides. And so you have legislation that starts to protect people from this. Artists also start responding to this. A group of conceptual artists called operating under this banner of Earthworks, and there were several who participated in this. This was kind of one of the inaugural projects, just a panel, a painted panel called "The Color Men Choose When They Attack the Earth," and that's actually what it says in that little center panel, but you can't see it. So the shorthand of the color of the equipment, that now we know, that's what we're going to criticize. That's the shorthand. The bulldozer starts to become something that we're more critical of, and so this machine goes from hero to kind of demon. Robert Smithson uses the bulldozer and other equipment to create spiral jetty, but also partially buried woodshed, where he uses an excavator to dump earth on top of a building until it collapses, showing the kind of violence. Seeing bulldozers as paintbrushes, as one of these artists said, using them as artistic tools, but also kind of stopping time in a way that construction projects don't. You always cover over that intermediate clearance step, and we lose the devastation and the violence, whereas the artists force us to look at that. And so they're doing something quite interesting with the same tools. Michael Heizer, he's the iconic cowboy artist operating these bulldozers, creating big ramps out in the desert, clearing away of earth there. Gordon Matta-Clark, similar story with buildings. I've talked less about building destruction, but that's a big part of this as well. And he has videos showing bulldozers wrecking homes, and again, stopping time. And I think that's what's really important. Bulldozers are fast. They speedily clear away, and before you even have time to stop it, right? You think about demolitions that occur in this city and the fight to try to get this building listed on the register before the demolition can begin. They're slowing time down, and time is very important to this story. Children's literature starts telling more complicated stories over time, too, as the tide turns on this machine. This book showing a little girl having a nightmare about her apartment in Manhattan being destroyed by a bulldozer. And that X on her forehead is like the X's that go on the windows of a building that's to be demolished. And then in non-children's literature, this comic book called the thing called Killdozer, where a bulldozer gets possessed and starts attacking people. And Soylent Green, which doesn't have bulldozers, but it has these buckets at the front that are like bulldozer blades, or like front loader blades, actually, more accurately. That's what's used to scoop up the people, to turn them into the Soylent Green. So you have, the cultural representation start to turn at the same time as resistance out in the landscape starts to turn, as people, environmentalists respond to this, and the bulldozer becomes their icon of what they're trying to stop in saving the land from the rape that's occurring for development. And as populations being displaced for urban renewal and highways also stand literally in front of the bulldozer by way of trying to stop this machine too. And it's not that they are blaming the machine, of course. It's not the technology that has gotten us here, but it is that ideology and that whole culture of clearance that uses these machines in certain ways that is in check now a bit more because of historic preservation and environmental legislation, different planning practices that come up from below rather than above. But of course, it's still there. It still continues. We still have the children's books celebrating this. There's still something exciting and progressive about the clearing away and the new, but hopefully lessons learned from this time period kind of balance that out with other ways of building and reusing as well. So thank you. We can skip the videos.
Like to do now, I'm just going to be loud, is open it up to questions. So we should have a microphone coming around. There's a microphone. And thank you guys so much. That was amazing. It was such a pleasure to hear you read and to hear about your project and to hear them at the same time. And while y'all are thinking of your questions, I wonder if you guys could start out by talking a little bit more about why you're both drawn to artistic representations of tools that engage with the built environment, that what is it that artistic representations, whether photography or children's literature or poetry, helps process? And then in what way can artistic representations be useful for both creating and shifting ideology around clearance? We'll start there and circulate.
I think in the same way that you've been successful in doing, there is an art in the non-explicitly artistic too, in the technical documents, and in the way people talk to each other. I read a lot of building manuals, documents that were not really meant to be read by people outside the trade, and the kind of glee and joy and excitement comes through in the language of those about the possibilities, the vast possibilities. And so, lines like, there's no site that cannot be tamed, to serve man. It was, the construction boom of this time was real, but it was not just construction, it was destruction, and that was embedded in it. So I think there's kind of art everywhere, but I think also that the public trying to come to terms with how they were processing it and other stories they were hearing, I think these cultural representations give us a window into that we don't otherwise have. Oral histories were useful as well, but the vast volume of media came together to tell a story that I didn't see in non-artistic stories. Journalism, but, and then, as I said, the children's books are just a wonderful source because of the just explicitness of them, and simplicity, really paring down the message. But, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. There's something, about sort of the... it's, for me, at least, getting into some of the things that I've worked with in the engineering field, and in terms of encountering this language for the first time, a lot of it is sort of fantastic. As you mentioned, like, we have clamshell cranes and sheep's foot rollers, and they sort of give way onto sort of a more imaginative take, and yeah, I think that was at least my entry into it was just sort of being, kind of amused by these sorts of things, and whether it be a geological description of a piece of land or a piece of machinery. So.
Happy to be here and hear all of your presentations. I have to ask how you found your way to being a municipal inspector. I'm a civil engineer and have worked as one for many years, and I'm just kind of curious how you found your way into that world. And also, I really appreciated just some of the words that you used to describe field sites, having been on a site before.
Thanks. I came into it at a really strange sort of angle. In college, I studied art history and English, and so it really wasn't part of my purview. And coming out of school, I ended up working on an archaeological site in Sicily for a summer. And it's there where I was doing a number of things, digging, doing draftsman work, but I also picked up some rudimentary survey work. And when I came out, I knew I was a poet, and I just needed to figure out how to support myself and live, which is, part of the creative act of being a poet. And, I had done this surveying thing, and I loved Henry David Thoreau, so I was like, maybe this is an appropriate thing for me to do. Okay. And so that's kind of how I got into it. And actually, the municipal inspection is kind of a result of, so with land survey, which I had done more often for a number of years, when I started in 2005, our company had 3 teams of 2 men going out each day. Okay. And now with GNSS technology, we basically have 1 professional surveyor. And so my role at the company has had to change because of that. Okay. And so that's how I came into municipal inspection.
Cool. And I also have a question for Francesca. I unfortunately have not read your book yet, but now I'm very interested to do so. It seems like your focus was more on the demolition side of construction equipment. Have you begun to think about a follow-up with regards to actual construction? Because some of the ideas you were presenting are kind of about how we can tame anywhere to build wherever. And a piece of equipment that came to my mind when you were talking about some things are pile drivers, which make it possible to build on areas where there's very high water tables.
Yeah.
And with climate change coming and lots of those places not going to be viable places to live, but are they still because of our technology?
Right.
Sort of a thing.
Well, it's the bulldozer is a double-sided sword. If when there's a landslide, that's more work for the bulldozer, right? It comes and it clears away what's been there too. And when fires start, so the problems that are created also create new opportunities. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling tool. So that's good for the bulldozer. That's it's not necessarily so great for other things. But yeah, there is obviously a way in which these tools can be used. And completely, we can't just live in rehabilitated buildings. We'll need more construction, et cetera. And as part of my research, I spoke with an engineering professor who had been active as a consultant on some of these California projects, advising on, okay, if we're going to reshape the land, obviously these flat building pads, they're not going to be stable, but can we do other things? Can we learn about soil profiles, right? And so how can we be more thoughtful about this? And so he saw these machines as having great potential, but you had to use them in a certain way. And then so he gave me one of the clips, which I didn't show, which just showed these excavators doing this ballet performance and just saying these machines, they're these hulking dinosaur-like things, but they're also really precise and really we can use them in much more interesting and sustainable ways than just flat building pads, right? So it's very much about the bigger picture that you have, and then how can we use these tools here. But if we start with the tools and just say, what can we do fast and quick, that's kind of gets us into these situations here, I think.
Thank you both so much for those great presentations. My question is more for Francesca. It struck me kind of in the images you were showing and as you were talking that there are at least two very different types of landscapes that you're showing these bulldozers intervening in, namely urban and rural landscapes. Some of the photos you showed us of California are very clearly of kind of suburbanization processes of leveling the land, whereas you also showed some images of urban demolition. And so I guess I'm curious, with this moment that you identified kind of in the 60s and 70s of turning of a change in the cultures of response to the idea of the bulldozer, right, and this idea of the rape of the land. I'm curious if these discourses coming out at that moment that are more critical of the bulldozer or of clearance, are they thinking kind of more specifically about those rural landscapes? Are they concerned kind of explicitly just about the land, or do they also accommodate a kind of concern for urban demolition for the particular populations that might be more affected by that? Are they discourses that see the bulldozer in a negative way just because of nature, or are they also kind of directly concerned about people?
They're two different discourses sometimes. The environmentalists, some of whom are living out in these new suburbs, so they're benefiting from the bulldozing that happened, but then they're saying, wait, it's going too far. And then there's also the urban populations. Freeways actually unite both. And so they're really interesting in that regard because the highways are going through forests, but they're also going through the neighborhoods where the minority populations are living in the city. So it's really the highways that bring both of those groups together. And so the highways become some of the most vocal early protests. The freeway revolts become sooner than really effective urban renewal resistance too. It's the highways. But then once that gets started, everyone kind of builds on. And you have urban renewal resistance getting more potent in some cities too. What people are really doing is kind of pushing back as long as they can, trying to bring in stakeholders with some power, because very often the neighborhoods that are targeted and even the landscapes that are going to be affected are connected to less powerful constituencies, right? So it's easier to get these projects through quickly. But if they hold out long enough and kind of wait for the legislative stop guards that are introduced, which are for urban renewal, the cessation of the program in 1974 and the rise of community development. You also have the mid-'70s. You have environmental impact statements being required, and so that arises too. And that legislation slows things down in time for even less powerful groups to have some review over what's going on. So they come together, and it is the freeways that kind of do that. But they're petering along in parallel too, and not seeing connections. And trying to bring those two things together is one of the projects that I was pursuing too, showing very similar practices going on, proceeding in parallel, but they're really protesting against a similar ideology and a similar thing, even though it's having very different impacts and it's different populations arguing, but they have similar complaints and they're well served by getting their protests together.
I have a I have a somewhat related question having to do with the people in the landscapes that you're both working with. So Jason, I'm curious to know if, especially now that you're more of a municipal, inspector than a land surveyor, if you're seeing more people in your job than you used to, and if as a land surveyor, you ever thought about the people who ever peopled your landscapes, the landscapes you were moving through. And I know that you also have used that experience to kind of collect found objects and bring those into your artistic practice. So I'm just wondering how empty your landscapes are or how peopled they are. And then I have a related question for Francesca, which is, it seems to me that the emphasis on clearing, it sounds to me like the emphasis on clearing that cuts across both of the kinds of narratives of the Bulldozer assumes an empty land. And so that's what unites this idea of clearing land versus clearing people. Mm-hmm. And this is a kind of off-the-wall question, but I recently saw the movie Wall-E. And it's just now striking me that is maybe just a very updated version of these very old children's books, which suggest that clearing will save us all. But of course, that movie is also predicated on the notion that people are already completely absent from the planet, and it's the clearing that will bring them back and that will renew the planet. And the whole narrative of environmental destruction is reduced to this idea that all we have to do is clear the garbage. So two very different questions for both of you.
Yeah, so certainly as a surveyor, even when I started, a lot of that work was done, by myself with a handheld GPS or else the GNSS system. Now, a lot of the times you're by yourself. Actually, this summer in particular, I have actually done a lot of farm preservation work, and so I'm with one other surveyor that I go out and onto a farm, and we walk around the farm all day and make maps. And so you get to know each other very well in that particular case. But otherwise, there's a lot of headspace too in terms of where you're at and what you're thinking about and how you're perceiving the world too. Out on a farm, 10 o'clock in the morning, the right light, it's really pretty vast. On municipal inspection jobs, it's a very social job. So I'm with an entire crew of construction workers, with the contractor, and then you're also working with any number of residents who have questions about what's happening, what's going on. Can you replace this? Da 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 da. And it's so that's a very particularly social job. And I think for at least for me, I think there are things I appreciate about both of those places, and even in the work. There's something. In writing poems about those things, each one I think gives way to a different set of spaces. One possibly more contemplative, and another one, a little more. Those poems get written quickly on the municipal inspection, job sites because I don't have a lot of time and I'm moving quickly and things are happening quick. So, yeah.
So I haven't seen Wall-E, but this idea of clearing land versus clearing people, I never ran across anything that talked about let's clear the people, right? But that's the unstated part of the story. Part of what interested me at the beginning of this project was, how did those people who were going to be relocated get behind this as well? New Haven is the site that I look at for the urban renewal part of the story, and Mayor Lee, urban renewal was the cornerstone of his administration, and the mayoral elections are every 2 years in New Haven, and he was elected 8 times, and so by vast margins, people believe that it was a modernization project where people would be temporarily relocated and then they would come back. And by and large, they didn't get to come back because what was built was out of their price range, or even when they said they were going to build something in their price range, when push came to shove, they didn't. So people were displaced. So it wasn't originally even described as a displacement project. It was a temporary clearing, and people can get behind that if they're going to maybe be a part of the new beginning. And they can see photographs were really instrumental. These surveys that showed poor building conditions. I mean, objectively speaking, electricity, plumbing, all these sorts of things that were going to be improved upon and were, but the people had to be relocated for that. How it played out, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is that what played out in the process was very different from the stories told at the beginning, and even the stories told after sometimes too. If we look at the process, what was it like, and why was it so clear that people would be behind this at first and then would turn as the process went on. So process is really important to the story of how this went down.
Thanks, both. Sorry, Jason, this is for Francesca too, but you could chime in on. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Francesca, what I like this idea of clearance. You can't see me, I'm short. Sorry. This idea of clearance. Did you come across, or can you imagine, or have heard or seen ideas of these technologies as clearing things that were bad in the environment? So I'm thinking of land remediation around this time in the 70s and 80s, where groups are getting together to clear things from the environment that are known to be toxic, known to be bad, so centuries-old industrial landscapes, remediating those spaces for either some sort of development or some sort of public health initiative. And if so, where does a technology like this fit into that narrative? Is it still kind of a positive, or is the technology actually decentered and kind of supplanted by this sort of narrative of environmentalism or some sort of grassroots effort? So in other words, where does that technology fit in a similar narrative of clearance?
So I didn't come upon those stories in my keyword searching on Bulldozer and different pieces of equipment. So it seems to me that it's probably a more delicate operation than these machines. As much as I said they are very accurate and everything, that you probably would need to be more protected as an operator too than you would be in a bulldozer. But it's probably related equipment, and so it would resuscitate the image of these big earth-moving technologies in the process, I would think. And that probably is a 1970s story, that kind of where I end my project and the resurrection of these machines. In one of the Gordon Matta-Clark projects, he takes a bulldozer and goes to a landfill, Fresh Kills, and he uses the bulldozer to push things around there. It's actually not that useful. There's so much stuff, and so I tend to think that maybe just some other instrument would have been necessary there. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was some active marketing associated with resuscitating these machines. The Vietnam War is important to this story too, because construction equipment doesn't figure in there in the same way as it did in World War II. The machinery that's used there to cut through the Vietnamese jungles, it's bigger. It has no domestic applications. There's tree crushers and there's different kinds of things. And the story of the machine of the bulldozer gets disassociated a little bit from U.S. war. Now, Israel, that's a different story, right? And that story is more recent. But I have to imagine that these companies, and Caterpillar is very mindful of its reputation. It sued Disney or whichever company it was that made George of the Jungle 2, which was not even a theater release. That was it straight to DVD, because there is a scene where they actually blame the dozers for the clearance, for the damaging of the jungle that's going on, and so
That's like a guns don't kill people sort of argument.
exactly,
Yeah, right.
exactly. So they care a lot about these things. So that's something worth investigating, the resuscitation of the machine as environmentalism comes to the rise in response, but then how can these tools be useful in saving the destruction that we've wrought? That'd be worth looking into.
I had a question for Jason. In the poem Field, was there a connection between the words you were writing and the specific diagrams? Were those poems that were thought up on the diagrams of sites you had visited? Were they unrelated? Was there kind of a loose connection, or what was the connection between kind of the background images or background of those pages and the words that were on them?
So sometimes I sought to include an image in which, the poem directly related or somehow gave way to the writing. But in a lot of cases, I was writing poems, on these job sites, and then I was taking an image from a document that I'd been working with that day that I just found interesting, or that I thought, was particularly, illuminating somehow to my understanding of what I was doing. And I married those two things together. So, yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
As a historian investigating art forms, it's very hard for me to tap into reception a lot of times of how people saw these things and actually experienced them, what they thought about it. I wondered with your poems, if you share them with the people you work with and what kind of reception, how they respond to this and whether they relate to the characterizations or just, how they respond, really.
This is a great question. I don't shy away from talking about myself as a poet on these work sites, or talking about poetry, or sharing poems, and the reaction is not so different from sort of the general public and altogether, but some are amused, some are curious to ask questions about it, but mostly, I think it's a small dismissal and a small confusion about what that is. I have to say that the people at my specific office really are, they without a doubt they are interested and try to figure out what it is all of these things that I'm involved with, are about. And I've mentioned it before. Davey mentioned the reading series that I do in Philadelphia, and that's a sort of a community-based effort and involves lots of different people. And for whatever reason, everyone can understand that and understand this social gathering and understand a community as such. But when it comes to the actual poems, it gets a little more nebulous. I don't know what anyone at my company would make of Field for Peter Colley.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit, Jason, about sort of the relationship of your poems on the page in terms of like the physical space that they're occupying on the page and sharing with these diagrams, which to me seems to sort of reflect like what's actually going on in these off the page, the real spaces that you're in. Do you think like the way that you're arranging the words, is that happening before and then you're fitting them into these pages, or what I'm trying to say?
yeah. I don't think I'm doing anything particularly novel in terms of the placement of the words. This is something that has been done in poetry for a very long time, and odd placements of poems, or and it's not something. If anything, it's sort of indicating that I'm trying to fit poetry into my work life, and that's maybe the sort of like being crunched out there or in the margins where, most poetry exists anyhow. It's that could be sort of something that maybe it's suggesting, but otherwise I don't think there's, any great move behind that.
Yeah, thank you.